just to admit that. Though there was a huge fall in defence spending while you were Foreign Secretary. But isn't it time to say, look, put your hands up? It was a big mistake.
Yeah, actually, when I was Foreign Secretary, we did build 2 aircraft carriers. We had minesweepers in the Gulf. We always had.
Well, you inherited these from Gordon Brown. William Hague, Foreign Secretary under David Cameron, has turned out to be an unlikely supporter of Keir Starmer's approach to war in Iran. Let's speak to him now. William Hague, you've said Donald Trump hasn't been clear about his war aims. What's not clear?
Well, as we've heard, the statements have varied about whether the objective is regime change or the nuclear program of Iran or the ballistic missile program of Iran.
It's all of that.
It is all, yes, that's what I was about to say, that it's from the military activity, it's all of those things. But nevertheless, to accomplish all of those things, particularly the regime change, is extremely difficult. That is the hazardous bit. That is the bit that risks the chaotic situation in Iran. The military objectives, I think, will be achieved and are being achieved by the United States and Israel.
No, but there are 2 things at stake here, and I think you're kind of fudging them. One is, what are the war aims? The second issue is, can they be achieved? But you said it was unclear what the war aims are. Now, on within hours of the hostilities breaking out, Donald Trump outlined 4 war aims, which his cabinet ministers have reiterated: to make it impossible for Iran to build a nuclear arsenal, to degrade and destroy its missile stockpiles and production capabilities, regime change, and no more financing and arming of the Iranian proxies, Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, others, which have spread terror across the Middle East. Now, you can say they might be unachievable, you can disagree with them, but it's clear enough what the war aims are.
Yes, my main point is that they may not be achievable, that there's a risk of chaos. But I think it's also true that different members of the U.S. administration have made different statements. And the president himself on Monday didn't reiterate the regime change part of it. So it does add to the confusion about whether that is part of the objective. But no, my main criticism is that may not be achievable. The consequences of that could be a chaotic situation in Iran. After all, we've experienced that before, of course, many times in Iraq, Syria, Libya, of course, which I was involved in myself. We've experienced that. That's more likely than some transition to a pro-Western democratic opposition. But great though that would be to see. And that's a big risk strategically to the United States and to the Middle East. So it's not a risk I would have recommended or taken. Now that the United States and Israel have started this, we should want it to succeed. We should want the Iranian people to be able to liberate themselves. Now this has started. But that's going to be a long, hazardous thing, and a lot of people could die in that process.
Now, you also say that Starmer was right to withhold the use of British bases from US forces. So if you'd been in charge, we'd be in the same pickle with America as we are now.
No, actually, what I said yesterday on Times Radio was I wouldn't have put it like the government has put it. They've made 2 separate decisions in the government. One is that they wouldn't allow the use of bases. This is the very point you were just putting to your previous guest. And then a second decision, as the Prime Minister described it, that it would be allowed for defensive operations. Actually, that should really have been one decision, to say to the United States at the beginning, well, actually, we have our problems with this. We have our doubts about this. We don't think you can do regime change from the skies. But of course, if you get into a fight with Iran, we don't want the Iranians to be able to loose off missiles against the Gulf states and so on. So you would be able to, let's define in advance what the defensive purposes are. Make that one decision. Because I think this situation could easily have been anticipated. It's been very likely for some time the US would attack Iran, and very likely that Iran would mount this kind of attempted defense. So I don't think the government handled that well. It's not been my position that I agree with the government on all of these things. They could have done much better at that.
But if you knew that the likely Iranian response was to attack the Gulf states, and it was as clear as night follows day that that's what they were going to do, if you knew that, why from the start would you therefore not have allowed America to use these bases? After all, not you, but the government then had to U-turn in 24 hours anyway.
No, that's exactly my point. So I don't think they've handled that well. This situation could have been anticipated, and also anticipated militarily as well. I think it is it's been a gap in the government's preparation for this, that there isn't a British ship in the Eastern Mediterranean, which there usually is and always was in the past.
There isn't a British ship in the Gulf.
It shows, yes, and we also used to have always stationed minesweepers in Bahrain, and that's another gap, because I think one of the things that's going to happen here is when the ballistic missiles have stopped flying out of Iran, there will still be the threat of large numbers of mines and anti-ship missiles being launched into the Strait of Hormuz by Iran. So pre-positioned minesweepers would also have been a good idea.
Well, we just moved the last one.
So no, please don't get the idea I'm making some blanket defense of the government. I'm absolutely not. But I do sympathize with their overall position that regime change from the skies is an unlikely thing to happen.
Right. I understand that. But I'm not asking you about that, because I understand the difficulties of that. And we shall see. Also, I wouldn't continue to think that Donald Trump's definition of regime change is the same as George Bush or Dick Cheney. But that's another matter. Can you help us on this then, if you think it's all right now for the US to take off for defensive purposes? Can you tell us what the difference between a US bomber taking off from a British base for offensive purposes, how that's different from one for defensive purposes?
No, that's for the government to agree with the United States, because of course, what is defense can also be offense. Defense involves taking out missile launchers of the other side. If I was the government, I'm nowhere near, it's more than 10 years since I left government, I would define that in quite an expansive way. I would say that defense does include being able to destroy assets that are attacking you inside the opposing country. So I would suggest to ministers that they define that in a pretty expansive and generous way. Again, now that this war has begun, that would be my recommendation, but how they do that is up to them.
Anglo-American relations have had their ups and downs over the years. How serious is this down?
I think it's quite serious, because the president, this is a president who doesn't forget things easily. It's pretty serious. That doesn't mean that it could have been entirely avoided. You will remember, as I do, many previous disagreements. Suez, perhaps the most serious. But I think Margaret Thatcher even fell out with Ronald Reagan over Grenada. And of course, Harold Wilson never got involved militarily in the United States, the whole long war in Vietnam, despite a lot of pressure from President Lyndon Johnson to do so.
Though Vietnam never attacked Cyprus or sent sleeper cells to kill people on British soil, unlike the IRGC.
No, that's right. But many U.S. allies, such as Australia, did become heavily involved in Vietnam, and Britain didn't. So there are a lot of precedents, even post-Second World War, for disagreements on military operations between the UK and the US. And I don't think the UK government should be afraid of having those disagreements if it thinks it is right. It could manage them in a much better way, as we've just been discussing. But I don't think it should be afraid of having those. But it is quite a serious difference. The president will try to take it out on Britain in various ways, no doubt. On the other hand, we also have innumerable examples of President Trump deciding that someone who's differed from him is now his friend, so he's onto a new subject. He will be looking for allies in all sorts of other ways, in rivalry with China or whatever it may be. So the UK government will also have the chance to repair the damage that has been caused.
The war in Iran has exposed Britain's woeful lack of military preparedness. We've already said there isn't a warship in the Gulf. There isn't even one in the Mediterranean, anywhere in the Mediterranean. Isn't it time for the Tories to acknowledge their lamentable record on defence? I mean, when you were Foreign Secretary, defence spending fell in only 4 years by 22% in real terms.
Well, the defence spending has been falling for a long time, since the Cold, through successive governments. Should it have been ramped up in more recent years after the world has changed, really, which it has changed over the last decade? Yes, it should. And should it now? Yes, absolutely, it should. And now everybody's agreed on this now, of course, that we go to 3% and then 3.5% of GDP on defense, but it's not happening.
No.
So I think it is really important now that the government does find the finances to do this.
But you left Labour.
It can only do that through welfare reform. It will not be, as is very clear from Rachel Reeves' statement yesterday, that won't be supplied by economic growth. It can.
But you left
only
Labour a terrible legacy, didn't you? You left a hollowed out defence capability. Not you personally, but your party.
Well,
Isn't it
no,
time
not
just to admit
yes.
just to admit that? Though there was a huge fall in defence spending while you were Foreign Secretary. But isn't it time to say, look, put your hands up? It was a big mistake.
Yeah, actually, when I was Foreign Secretary, we did build 2 aircraft carriers. We had minesweepers in the Gulf. We always had.
Well, you inherited these from Gordon Brown.
I think we were in a rather better shape than we are today. But let's absolutely agree that governments collectively in recent times have not done what they should have done on defence. Now that should be in any coming election. That has got to be a big factor in British politics, that all the parties explain what they would do about that. We've got parties that would make it worse, like the Greens, who are currently doing well in elections. So it's important that this is really explained. We have to prepare for a different world, the world in which this sort of war takes place, and Ukraine, and potential confrontation over Taiwan is a much more dangerous world, and we cannot just sleepwalk into that.
No, well, some would say the world changed with the invasion of Crimea or the annexation of Crimea in 2014, but the Tory government continued to cut defence. But anyway, well, I've got you. What's happened to your old department? A senior diplomat who's resigning from the Foreign Office says in the Times today that some Foreign Office civil servants insist on working from home because the office is, quote, a colonial building, that serving UK produce in UK embassies was seen as falling foul of procurement laws, and that international law took precedence over the national interest. Was it as bad when you were Foreign Secretary?
No, it wasn't. I think we were very proud of UK produce, and everybody would have been working in the office when I was Foreign Secretary. And that would be the case. If I was Foreign Secretary today, that would still be the case. So yeah, I recommend the Foreign Secretary make sure she's got a really good grip on the department. International law, by the way, is very important, but in conjunction with the national interest, and the national interest is always paramount. So I was disturbed to read that. I don't know how widespread that opinion is in the Foreign Office, but it's important for foreign secretaries, not just senior civil servants, to have regard to the institution as a whole and to make sure it's got the right working atmosphere. I certainly hope it develops it.
All right, William Hague, thank you for joining us. And William is on Times Radio Breakfast every Tuesday at 9 a.m. Make sure to tune into that. Now,